There are some people who hate definition fights, but let's be honest, this is the internet. There are plenty of people who love a good definition fight. Welcome to Theocritic. My name is Theo. I'm a former Muslim who grew up in the West. Just to be clear, when it comes to definitions, I'm not telling you how to use words. This is just how I use them, and I'll make an argument for why I use them this way, but you do you. I'll respect other people's choices. Okay, so this is a Venn diagram. So here are some examples. So this is a concept of something that's mutually exclusive. There's cars inside the bubble. If this is a diagram about cars, the mutually exclusive category there would be non-cars, right? There's no overlap between cars and non-cars. The opposite of a car is not walking or bus or something like that. The opposite of a car is non-car. A staple, a cabbage, these are non-cars. Here's an example of overlap. So there's cars, there's white things, and then there are white cars. That's an overlap. A subset is something like cars versus white cars. They're still all cars, but they're just a subset. They're a particular type of car. Okay, so let's put this tool to good use. This is theism. So theists are believers, people who believe in a god or a deity of some sort. If you believe in a type of a deity, you are a theist, and that is this bubble over here. Outside of this bubble are all non-theists. So this is a mutually exclusive categories, which are represented by a bubble on a background. Now, the word non-theist, atheist, is everybody that's outside of this bubble. That's how I use this word. That's how I always use this word. There's a little bit more nuance over here, probably some weeds to get into, but it's important to understand this as a logical concept. Okay, so God is a being that belongs inside of another sort of a parent category, if you will. It's sort of a spiritual being or a supernatural being. And there are others that fall into that same category. But if you believe in ghosts or demons or jinns or angels and you don't believe in God, well, then I guess you believe in the supernatural. That's called supernaturalism. So there is a category around theism, which is supernaturalism. And then outside of that, there is this other category, naturalism. So when somebody calls themselves a naturalist, most likely what they mean is they're a philosophical naturalist. They don't believe in anything that is supernatural. So if someone only believes in the natural, they're a naturalist or a materialist. Now, there's another type of thing. Methodological naturalism is this special sort of overlapping category which you may actually have personal beliefs, but in the context of doing some practical thing, let's say science, you're not allowed to use any unfalsifiable explanations to explain why something happens. So for example, why do birds fly? You cannot use the explanation that it's because God keeps them in the air. You have to explain flight in terms of aerodynamic forces. And so it forces you to keep unfalsifiable explanations out of the context in which you're working, usually science. And so that means that you can only use naturalistic methods. Methodological naturalism is not a philosophy. It is simply a methodology, and it's part of the name. The naturalism I talked about a moment ago, materialism, people who only believe that the natural world is what exists, that is called philosophical naturalism. So that's the difference. If you're a naturalist in terms of your philosophy or just in terms of the methods that you use. Now, when we zoom out on this complete picture, atheism is just everything that is outside of theism, right? That's everybody that is not a theist is an atheist. Someone can be a supernaturalist and still be an atheist. Right? Somebody could believe in ghosts or magic, the Force or Harry Potter, whatever, but not believe in God. They are supernaturalist. But notice that God is a subset. So all naturalists are atheists. All naturalists are atheists, but not all atheists are naturalists. Okay, so let's get a little bit more into the weeds over here. There is hard and soft atheism. So, hard atheism is a positive claim that God doesn't exist. And soft atheism, sometimes known as lack theism or agnostic atheism, this basically means that I don't believe or I'm not convinced that theism is true. It sounds very similar, but there's a slight difference, and it's an important, subtle difference. If we met on the street and I said to you, I have $1 million in my account, you've never met me before, you might believe me, but you might not. You might say, I don't think so. You wouldn't be wearing those shoes if you had $1 million, right? So if you're not convinced of my claim, that is very different than when I go to a bank and the bank teller looks at my account and tells me, you do not have $1 million. Those are different claims. Neither one believes that I have $1 million in my bank account, but one of them is not stating it as a fact that it's factually true that I don't have $1 million. They just don't believe it. The other one is looking in my account and making a factual claim. This difference is really only relevant mostly in philosophy classrooms and in debates because, in debates, if you make a claim that there is no such thing as God, that God in fact doesn't exist, you have to prove that claim. Whereas if you simply say that, hey, all the evidence I've seen, I'm not convinced, it's a rejection of someone else's claim. And in the context of debates and arguments in essays in your classroom, these fall into different categories. But in a practical level, there isn't much of a difference, right? If you meet someone on the street and they don't really believe that you have $1 million, the only thing that's relevant is you have not convinced them that they have $1 million. Most people on the street don't have access to your bank account. It sort of falls on you to demonstrate that you have $1 million. You can show them a bank account statement. Maybe they will believe it. Maybe they'll think it's a forgery. In the case of most atheists, it's exactly like that. They're waiting for someone who makes the claim that God exists to present, a sufficient evidence to them, and their position is largely they're not convinced. I don't use that term. I'm not an agnostic atheist. I'm a hard atheist. I argue that God does not exist, but that's my position personally. That may not be someone else's position. I think most atheists are soft atheists. So while we're deep in the weeds over here, let's talk about agnosticism. So agnosticism means to not know, and it was coined by T.H. Huxley in 1869. So we have a date and a person. This is a relatively new, young word. So the original implication, the original meaning was that we don't know what is beyond the horizon of our knowledge. And so we can't really comment on that. If I were to ask you, what is the gas in Jupiter's atmosphere? What does that feel like? There's no way you could answer that question. It's just an absurd question. How could you possibly know? You are here on Earth. If you don't know something that is within our solar system and just on a neighboring planet, how can you make any comment about something that claimed to have existed outside of our universe and allegedly created our universe? How can you possibly speak to that? So the term agnosticism comes from a place of scientific humility and to acknowledge our own ignorance. We don't know. But as I understand it, he also used this word to get out of calling himself or labeling himself an atheist. But he also didn't want to call himself a Christian. Hard agnosticism is the position of we cannot know. It's not I don't know. It's not I haven't decided. It is not possible for any human to know. Anybody who comes and tells me that they know the mind of God, no, you can't possibly know. And so soft agnosticism has come to mean I'm not saying that God doesn't exist, but I don't believe. It's just saying, hey, I'm just going to talk about myself. I'm not convinced. Really the same thing as agnostic atheist or soft atheism. Either way, the important thing to understand here is an agnostic is not a theist, right? So it doesn't matter which form of agnosticism they choose. It doesn't matter if somebody says they're agnostic atheist or not. They are atheists because the position of atheist is someone who subscribes to the existence of God, and an agnostic doesn't. Now, that said, I want to add one more caveat over here while we're still in the weeds. Some people use this word agnostic in an entirely different way. And I personally know people who do this. Some people use the word to mean, I used to believe, but I'm not sure anymore. I'm fairly convinced that Islam doesn't make sense, Christianity doesn't make sense, but I haven't really completely figured out the whole God question yet. So for a lot of people, agnostic has come to mean something different, something like they're in transition or they're thinking about it. Now, I don't use this word this way, but you do you. On my channel and in my videos, I'm pretty much not going to use the word agnostic at all, so it doesn't matter to me. So in case any of you care how I use all of these words, when I say atheist, I strictly mean it on the basis of the Venn diagram, right? Which means that anybody who does not believe in the claim that God exists, that includes all agnostics. All of them are atheist. I think the word agnostic is simply unnecessary, so I never use it. And look, I get that a lot of you are not going to agree with that, and that's okay. Feel free to disagree. That's what the comment section is for, just below the like switch. Now, I am personally a philosophical naturalist. And to talk about this a little bit, let me kind of go into the definition of nature. Natural is anything that interacts with the universe. So if God created the universe, then God would be natural. If we have a soul, which, interacts with our bodies, interacts with us, that would be natural. I'm not eliminating anything by using this category of natural, right? Things are possible in nature, but they just have to be demonstrated. And so my criteria for allowing something as acceptable in my understanding of what is natural is that it has to be detectable. If there is a claim of something that interacts with the natural world, but all you have is a claim and it's not detectable, it's not measurable, it's not verifiable, it's not falsifiable, as far as I'm concerned, it's not there. It's not natural. Not to say that it isn't natural. For example, there could be creatures, there could be aliens that live on Jupiter. We don't know. We don't have the ability to detect it, to prove it, to falsify it. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And it doesn't mean that those creatures are not natural. So I'm not saying that, okay? But I am going to apportion my belief based on what can be detected. And for everything else in the universe and beyond, I leave an open mind. And so my standard for naturalism is anything that can interact with the universe, backed up by some detectability, something that counts as evidence. And if it isn't detectable, then I'm not signing up for it. Because if it isn't detectable, how do you know? How would anyone who's writing scripture know about something that isn't detectable? Right? And how dare people try to control my life based on their own convenient fiction? I find that unacceptable. If God exists and wants us to interact with him, he can show himself and interact with us. Otherwise, I have better things to do. Okay, so that's it for this one. So I have a video coming up next week that I think is very interesting. I have identified 3 elements that are required in every religion, and all religions would fall apart if even one of these 3 elements were missing. I'm looking forward to all of you guys, your comments on this one and on the next one. So thank you so much for joining. Thank you for subscribing, and welcome to Theocritic.